Maya Thompson stepped into the courthouse, her heels clicking against the polished floors. The vast, sterile space seemed cold, with long lines of people waiting for their cases to be called. Maya had never been one to let the pressure of a situation overwhelm her, but today, the weight of being there gnawed at her. She wasn't someone who got caught up in small legal matters like parking fines, yet here she was. She glanced around the room and immediately noticed the judge. Robert Harris, the stern man sitting at the bench, seemed like the embodiment of every image she had of an old-fashioned, no-nonsense figure in power. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his suit pressed perfectly. He looked every bit the part of a seasoned judge, a man whose decisions shaped lives with little emotion, and perhaps even less understanding. "Next case," the court officer announced. Maya straightened her shoulders, walking up to the bench with the poise of someone who'd learned to navigate difficult spaces. She handed over her ticket and stood at attention, waiting for the judge to speak. Judge Harris didn't immediately glance up. Instead, he flipped through a few papers, his eyes scanning the notes. "Maya Thompson," he said with a deep voice, sounding more like a command than a greeting. "You've been cited for an unpaid parking ticket. The fine is $75. Is there a reason you haven't paid it?" Maya resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She had so much more on her plate than a minor infraction, but she understood the process. "I was in the middle of a work emergency and didn't realize my time had expired," she explained, trying to keep her tone respectful. The judge barely acknowledged her explanation. "It's your responsibility to pay attention to these things," he said curtly, writing down his notes with a faint sigh. $75 is the penalty. Pay it promptly." She could feel the slight sting of his words, though she kept her composure. Maya Thompson, a woman leading national efforts to change how women were paid for their work, was being reduced to a mere statistic in a system that often failed to recognize the full scope of who she was. She wasn't just any woman. She was a leader in gender pay equity reform. Yet here, she stood as just another name on the court's docket. As she turned to leave, the judge's eyes followed her for a moment longer than expected. For a split second, Maya felt something shift, but it was fleeting. The courtroom, for all its power, had no space for understanding the bigger picture, and the judge, it seemed, was too far entrenched in his ways to see beyond the legalities. Little did he know, the woman he had just fined was leading a movement that would reshape policies on a national scale. Maya left the courthouse with a sense of quiet frustration, but she didn't let it linger for long. The world she truly cared about was out there, far beyond the courtroom's sterile walls. As she walked through the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., she felt a familiar sense of purpose settle over her. There was a battle to be fought, and it wasn't going to be won by focusing on the minor setbacks of daily life. Her office, nestled in one of the towering buildings downtown, was a reflection of the urgency she felt in her work. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city, but Maya's attention was on the task at hand. She entered the sleek conference room, where her team was already assembled, policy experts, economists, and lawyers, everyone working toward the same goal: gender pay equity. It was a fight she'd been in for years, and now, with the weight of a federal task force behind her, the stakes were higher than ever. "Morning, everyone," Maya greeted as she sat down at the head of the table, her presence commanding attention. She had been appointed to lead the task force by the president himself, tasked with addressing the persistent wage gap that existed between men and women in nearly every sector. Her team was tasked with developing a set of policies that would not only ensure equal pay for equal work, but also hold corporations accountable for gender-based pay disparities. As the meeting began, Maya outlined the agenda for the day: a review of the proposed legislation that would mandate pay transparency across all industries. Companies would be required to publicly disclose the wages of all employees, categorized by gender and race. The goal was simple: shine a light on the pay gap that was often hidden behind corporate boardrooms and executive decisions. "We have a chance to make history here," Maya said, her voice steady but passionate. We have a chance to change the conversation, to make sure that women, and particularly women of color, are finally compensated fairly for their work. Her team dove into the details, discussing the potential challenges and pushback they might face. Some industries, particularly tech and finance, had deep-rooted cultures that resisted change. But Maya was undeterred. She knew that her leadership had already started to spark conversation across the country. Major companies had begun voluntarily releasing pay equity reports, influenced by the growing pressure to be transparent. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. By the time the meeting ended, the group had outlined key next steps, but Maya's mind was already racing toward the next challenge. She'd been fighting this battle for years, advocating for legislation, pushing for systemic change, and challenging entrenched corporate practices. Yet there were still so many who didn't see the importance of this work, who continued to dismiss the issue as something not urgent. As she looked out over the city from her office window, Maya knew that with every step forward, she was inching closer to a future where no woman would ever have to fight for equal pay again. But little did she know, her day in court had been the start of an unexpected journey that would force even her harshest critics to reckon with the impact of her mission. Judge Robert Harris sat at his desk in his chambers, a stack of case files spread in front of him. The afternoon sunlight streamed through his window, casting a warm glow over the room, but it did little to lift his mood. As a judge, he had seen his fair share of cases, petty disputes, criminal charges, family issues, and while he prided himself on being fair and impartial, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. The world was changing, and he wasn't sure if he was keeping up. At 62, Judge Harris had been on the bench for over 30 years. He had always believed in the law, the structure of it, the belief that it was an equalizer, no matter one's background. But over the last few years, as he watched the news and heard the voices of activists calling for systemic change, he began to question whether the law was doing enough to protect those who needed it most, especially women. It wasn't just about criminal justice anymore. It was about fairness in every aspect of life. And lately, the most persistent issue on his mind was gender pay equity. It had started when his daughter, Emily, returned from her first job out of college. A bright, ambitious young woman, Emily had quickly landed a position at a major law firm. However, her excitement was tempered by the realization that her male colleagues, who were doing the same work, were making more money than she was. The injustice of it ate her, and she became vocal about it at home, pushing her father to consider whether the legal system was doing enough to address pay disparity. Emily had even suggested that her father, with all his influence, could help push for change. At first, Robert dismissed it as youthful idealism, but now, as he read more about the national gender pay gap, he couldn't ignore the truth in her words. Emily wasn't the only one making him think. News stories about the fight for equal pay were everywhere. He'd seen the headlines about companies that were being sued for pay discrimination, the lawsuits filed by women who had been denied fair compensation for years. But what struck him the most was the growing movement, led by women like Maya Thompson, who were demanding that lawmakers and businesses take action. Robert's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," he called. His assistant, Sarah, stepped in. "Judge Harris, there's a case that just came in. A woman named Maya Thompson. She's here for a minor parking fine, but it said she's a leader in federal gender pay equity reform." He raised an eyebrow. Maya Thompson. That name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it immediately. Federal gender pay equity reform. What's that about? Sarah hesitated. "I don't know the details, but it's something significant. She's been in the news lately, pushing for legislation that requires pay transparency." A fleeting thought crossed Robert's mind. Was this the same woman he'd found earlier today? The one he had brushed off so easily in court? As the pieces started to fall into place, his curiosity grew. This wasn't just another case. The woman standing before him, the one he had dismissed without a second thought, was at the forefront of a battle he hadn't fully understood until now. Maybe, just maybe, He had more to learn than he realized. Judge Harris couldn't shake the name Maya Thompson from his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had made a quick judgment about her. The woman he had found just a few hours ago was not just a random person passing through his courtroom. She was a key player in one of the most important national conversations of the moment. He wasn't used to being wrong, especially not when it came to making judgments about people. Yet something about her kept nagging at him. The next morning, he decided to look deeper into Maya's work. He sat at his desk, the morning light filtering through his office window, and typed her name into a search engine. The results were almost immediate. Headlines from major news outlets flashed across his screen, all highlighting her role in the fight for gender pay equity. His eyes skimmed the articles. Maya Thompson, a prominent lawyer and activist, had been appointed to lead a federal task force dedicated to addressing the wage gap between men and women. She had appeared before Congress, met with top CEOs, and was working on groundbreaking legislation that would mandate companies to disclose their pay scales and take action to eliminate disparities. The more Robert read, the more his initial assumptions unraveled. Maya wasn't just an advocate. She was a force of nature, tirelessly pushing for systemic change. Her task force was working on legislation that would force companies to reveal their pay structures, requiring them to be accountable for pay gaps. As he read about her commitment to fairness, transparency, and justice, Robert felt a growing sense of humility. He couldn't help but contrast her work with his own. Here he was, a man who had spent decades in the legal system, making decisions that impacted people's lives. Yet, when it came to the broader issues of equality and fairness, he was far from the front line. He had never once considered the weight of systemic pay inequality, never fully realized how deeply embedded these issues were in the fabric of American society. A deep sense of regret began to form. He had been dismissive of Maya the moment she entered his courtroom, quick to judge her based on a trivial matter, an unpaid parking ticket. He had not taken the time to consider who she was, what she stood for, or the larger work she was doing in the world. His decision to fine her, without a second thought, seemed like a small but stark symbol of how little he understood about the broader issues she was fighting for. Robert sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew he had to do something. This wasn't just about apologizing for a fine. This was about recognizing the truth. He had been blind to something far more important than the law he'd upheld in his courtroom. Maya Thompson wasn't just another defendant. She was a leader, a trailblazer, and a catalyst for change, and he had missed it entirely. He had a lot of thinking to do, and it was clear now that Maya's work was about much more than policy. It was about justice, real justice, and it was time for him to learn what that really meant. For the next few days, Judge Robert Harris couldn't shake the guilt that had settled in his chest. Every time he sat at his desk, reviewing case files or making his usual rulings, his thoughts kept drifting back to Maya Thompson. He'd find her without hesitation, assuming she was just another defendant who had failed to manage a minor infraction. But she wasn't just another person. She was leading a national charge for gender pay equity, an issue he had never fully understood or given enough thought to. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the larger realization that his own actions, small as they were in that courtroom, reflected a larger blind spot in his understanding of equality and justice. Maya had been dismissed not just by him, but by the very system that was supposed to protect and uplift people. His years of experience in the legal world hadn't prepared him for the fact that some battles were bigger than the laws themselves. One morning, after another long session of reflecting on his mistake, Robert decided he couldn't let it go. He had to do more than just think about the situation. He had to make it right. He grabbed a pen and paper, carefully drafting a letter to Maya Thompson. He wasn't sure how it would be received, but he knew it was necessary. Dear Ms. Thompson, I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to extend a formal apology for my actions in the courtroom the other day. I did not take the time to understand who you were or the work that you are doing, and as a result, I made a decision that I now regret deeply. After further reflection, I've come to realize that the fine I imposed on you was not just a minor mistake. It was an oversight of who you are as a leader and a champion for equality. I should have taken the time to learn more about you before rushing to judgment. I understand that no apology can undo the harm of my actions, but I want to offer my sincerest regret. You are doing critical work for our country, and I am now aware of the significance of what you're fighting for. If you are willing, I would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you, to learn more about your work, and discuss how we might better serve the causes of justice and equity. Sincerely, Judge Robert Harris. He sat back after finishing the letter, wondering if his words would mean anything to Maya. The act of writing it had, in some ways, been cathartic, a way of acknowledging that he needed to grow, that the assumptions he had made had been damaging, not just to her, but to his own understanding of justice. He sent the letter off that afternoon, knowing it would be a while before he would hear back. But deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. This wasn't just about making amends for one mistake. It was about beginning a journey of understanding, and he hoped that Maya, despite everything, would be willing to guide him along the way. Maya Thompson read the letter from Judge Robert Harris with a mix of surprise and curiosity. She had expected some sort of acknowledgement, but this felt different, more personal, more genuine. In all her years of advocacy, she had encountered resistance from many corners, but rarely had she seen someone in a position of power take the time to reflect on their actions and openly admit to their mistakes. After a moment of contemplation, she decided to meet him. Maya was no stranger to difficult conversations. As a leader in the fight for gender pay equity, she had been through countless meetings with powerful figures, some of them resistant, others merely indifferent to the cause. But something told her this meeting with the judge could be different. A few days later, Maya arrived at the courthouse, her stride purposeful but calm. She was led into a small meeting room, where Judge Harris was already waiting. He stood when she entered, extending his hand with an air of tentative respect. "Miss Thompson, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he said, his tone warm but hesitant. "I appreciate you taking the time." Maya smiled, though it was a guarded one. "It's Maya, please, and I wanted to meet with you. I was surprised by your letter. I wasn't expecting an apology. I know it's not enough to undo what happened, but I want to make it clear that I realize how wrong I was in my actions," Judge Harris said, his voice steady but sincere. "I didn't understand who you were when you walked into my courtroom, and I didn't take the time to find out. I can't say I fully grasp everything about the gender pay gap, but after learning more about your work, I realize it's something I should have taken more seriously." Maya took a seat across from him, her expression softening. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Harris. It's not easy to admit when we've missed the mark, especially when we're so used to thinking we're in the right. But this conversation, it matters. It matters because it shows that even people in positions of authority can learn and grow. That's something we don't always see, especially when it comes to issues of gender and race." Judge Harris nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a new understanding. "I've been reflecting a lot on what you're doing, the work you're leading. It's about so much more than just a law or a policy. It's about justice, real justice. Equal pay for equal work shouldn't be up for debate, but it is, and I've been blind to that." Maya listened intently, sensing a shift in the room. It was rare to encounter someone with the courage to admit their blind spots, and rarer still to find someone willing to change their perspective. But here, in this small room, Judge Harris wasn't just apologizing for a past mistake. He was opening himself up to the possibility of transformation. "There's a lot of work left to do," Maya said thoughtfully, "but having someone like you, someone with influence, on our side, that makes all the difference. It's never easy to change the system, but it starts with people like you being willing to listen and learn." Robert Harris nodded, a sense of resolve settling in. He knew his journey had just begun. Over the following weeks, Judge Robert Harris and Maya Thompson continued their conversations. What began as a tentative meeting soon evolved into a powerful partnership, one that neither of them had anticipated but both found invaluable. For Maya, it was rare to encounter someone from the legal system who was truly willing to engage in a meaningful dialogue about gender equity. And for Judge Harris, the discussions opened his eyes to the complexities of the issue in ways he hadn't imagined before. Their meetings were often held in quiet rooms, with Maya explaining the intricate layers of the gender pay gap, how it wasn't just about blatant discrimination, but systemic inequalities embedded in corporate culture, hiring practices, and long-standing biases. She spoke about how pay transparency could be the first step toward real accountability, and the importance of legislation that not only mandated fairness, but required companies to take proactive measures to eliminate disparities. "I've been thinking about this a lot," Robert said one afternoon, leaning forward as he listened intently. "I think I've been too focused on the immediate, the visible cases in my courtroom. But this is something that affects every part of society, from the boardroom to the classroom to the courthouse. I've seen women come through my court who are struggling with unfair pay, and I never once asked why. I simply assumed it was a personal issue, not realizing how systemic it was." Maya nodded, her voice steady but passionate. "It's easy to overlook, especially if you don't see it firsthand. But it's in the fabric of our economy, and it's especially pervasive for women of color. It's about more than just individual stories. It's about creating a system that holds companies accountable, not just for their actions today, but for the years of inequity that have come before." Judge Harris thought about her words, reflecting on the growing knowledge he had gained. For years, he had seen the law as the ultimate authority, but he was beginning to understand that the law itself wasn't always enough. It had to be paired with empathy, awareness, and a willingness to address the deeper roots of inequality. In the months that followed, their partnership took on a new shape. Judge Harris became an unexpected ally in Maya's mission, using his platform to speak about the importance of gender pay equity in his own legal circles. He began making calls to other judges and legal professionals, urging them to consider the broader implications of the gender pay gap. Maya, for her part, continued her advocacy, pushing for legislation that would guarantee pay transparency and create real consequences for businesses that refused to comply. Together, they worked behind the scenes to ensure that the proposed reforms gained traction in Washington. Maya had always been an outsider to the establishment, fighting for change against the odds. But now she had an unexpected ally in a powerful figure within the very system that had once dismissed her. The more they collaborated, the more they realized that their unlikely alliance was stronger than either of them had imagined. Judge Harris had changed his stance, not just on gender pay equity, but on the idea of justice itself. And Maya, with her resilience and vision, had gained a new perspective on the importance of bridging the gaps between the legal system and the fight for true equality. Their work was just beginning, but for the first time, they both felt that meaningful change was within reach. Months passed, and the partnership between Maya Thompson and Judge Robert Harris continued to grow, leading to remarkable shifts in both their personal and professional lives. The legislative reforms they had worked so hard to champion were slowly taking shape, gaining traction in Congress. Maya's tireless efforts, combined with the unexpected support of Judge Harris, began to create ripples of change that were felt across the country. The day finally came when the first major piece of the pay transparency bill was introduced on the Senate floor. Maya stood in the gallery, watching the proceedings unfold. Her heart raced as the proposal was read aloud, acknowledging the need for full disclosure of wages within companies, with penalties for those who fail to comply. She could see the faces of lawmakers, some supportive, others hesitant, but one thing was clear: the conversation had shifted. Judge Harris, who had once been a skeptic, was now a vocal advocate for the bill. He had attended hearings, written op-eds, and made public speeches about the importance of addressing pay inequality. His transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. The judge who had once dismissed Maya as just another defendant had become a key ally in her mission to rewrite the rules of fairness in the workplace. One evening, after a particularly successful round of lobbying efforts in Washington, Maya received a call from Judge Harris. He was at home, but he sounded excited. "Maya," he said, his voice crackling with energy, "I just wanted you to know. I've been hearing from colleagues in the legal field about how much traction this issue is getting. We're making real progress. I never thought I'd see the day when the law would evolve this way." Maya smiled, grateful for his words. "I knew it was possible. It just took the right kind of momentum. But it's not over yet. We still have a lot of work ahead." Judge Harris' tone softened, and Maya could hear the respect in his voice. "You've been at this for so long, fighting for something so important. You didn't let anything stop you, even when people dismissed you, when they underestimated what you were capable of. I think that's the kind of courage this country needs." Maya paused, reflecting on how far she had come. Her journey had never been about proving people wrong, but about proving to herself that change was possible, that the system could be reformed. And now she was seeing that vision unfold. In the years that followed, the pay transparency bill would pass, setting a new standard for fairness in American workplaces. Judge Harris, once a distant figure in Maya's world, became a respected voice in the movement for gender equity. Their work together had sparked a nationwide conversation about equal pay, and the effects would be felt for generations to come. Maya knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be more work to do, but as she looked back on everything they had achieved, she realized that real change wasn't just about passing laws. It was about shifting hearts and minds. And in that, she and Judge Harris had succeeded beyond what either of them had ever imagined. Together, they had created a legacy of change, one that would endure long after the headlines faded.